Were there any news stories in your book that captured your interest?
I think, Marcus, if you take a look at the number of people that I have in the book, very often I try and put what they thought that was important to them at the time. And sometimes when you take a look at the witness statements or you take a look at some of the other things that are happening, what they put in there at the time has been lost. Sometimes it's been intentionally lost, sometimes it's been lost because the research simply wasn't available. Let me give you one example. Leslie Price was in the GPO. She actually married Tom Berry later on. So she goes by the name of Leslie DeBarra most of the time later on. But during the middle of the week, Tom Clark asked her to go to the Pro Cathedral to bring a priest over because there were men who were there who were wounded, dying, and he wanted them to get some spiritual comforting. She did. She went to the GPO. There was fighting going on all the time, so it was a very dangerous mission. It took a tremendous amount of courage just for anyone to leave the GPO with all the bullets flying. When she got to the Pro Cathedral, she knocked on the door of the rectory, and she did so 2 or 3 times before someone would even answer. And it was Father Flanagan, and she asked him to come over, but he refused. And he said at first that no, that he thought that these people were wrong, and he did not want to get involved with that. So she pleaded with them, and she said that there were people over there who were being wounded, some might have died, and they needed some spiritual comforting. So finally he acquiesced, and he did so. She talked about, though, in her witness statement about the way back. And when they did, they found a man who was wounded, a civilian who was wounded on the street. But when Father Flanagan went over to comfort him, he obviously knew that the man had been drinking, and so Father Flanagan just left him in the street. As they continued on their way back to the GPO, there was another man who was sort of a toff, and Flanagan went over to there, and he actually gave that man the last rites. And then they continued to the GPO. Flanagan heroically stayed in the GPO for a great deal of time, ministered tremendously to the people there. But I just thought it was interesting maybe as to the times, as to how one person in the street would be treated as opposed to how another person in the street would be treated.
Is there anything misunderstood or controversial that you discovered about the events of 1916?
Marcus, one of the things that's said about 1916 is that it was a blood sacrifice. I think that in itself must be examined and looked at very, very carefully by people. And one of the reasons that it said it was a blood sacrifice is a quotation by James Connolly when they were leaving Liberty Hall. A friend of his who took over and it was very important in the Union, William O'Brien, came up to him and said, "Is there any chance at all?" And Connolly said, "None at all. We're going out to get slaughtered." And that's often quoted to him. And it's often said by that it was an intended blood sacrifice on his part. We must remember that everything changed after Sunday to Monday, and certainly Connolly knew at that point that with all the problems that they probably were not have a chance in the Rising itself. But remember that when Padre Pierce earlier said that the good earth has to be the red wine going in blood, the good earth is what's necessary. Connolly said, "We do not think that the good earth needs to that, and we think that anybody who says that is a blithering idiot." So Connolly was not in any way involved in a blood sacrifice. He knew that people were going to die. He knew probably he was going to die. But I think it's misunderstood. The whole concept of a blood sacrifice is misunderstood and should be studied. Should be studied very, very carefully. If I were to say to you, for example, a quotation that goes approximately like this, and I'm going to paraphrase a tiny bit, but it's only because my memory is so bad. But if I say to you that the tree of liberty must be fertilized from time to time with the blood of patriots, that's its natural fertilizer. It sounds pretty bloodthirsty. It sounds like it would be pretty appropriate for a blood sacrifice in Dublin in 1916. It wasn't said by that. It was said by Thomas Jefferson in 1787. Nice. And I don't think anybody would ever say that Thomas Jefferson was involved in a blood sacrifice or that he was a bloodthirsty person. So when you look at the language, you look at what's said, I think you have to look at the times, how it's said, and why, and then study it before you make up your mind.
Did the Irish Citizen Army and the volunteers always see eye to eye, or was there a disagreement?
I think there was always disagreement, and the disagreement goes back to the very inception of both. Remember the Lockout was in 1913. The volunteers were established in November of 1913. And very often when you take a look at what happened, it goes back to the idea of on which side were you in 1913 in the lockout. So there are a great many people who didn't feel that the persons who ultimately established the volunteers were as forceful for labor as they should have been. Even to the degree that there were some people from Scotland who came over here who had stolen some explosives in Scotland, and they brought them to Liberty Hall. By mistake, they were supposed to go with the volunteers, and the Liberty Hall was going to let them loose. And finally, Thomas MacDonagh went down there and said, okay, we'll make a deal. You keep some, we'll keep some. Most of that only ended in January of 1916, when James Connolly actually got together with the leaders of the volunteers and military council. And at that point, they decided that they were going to be on one page, and that they were going to go ahead for a rising. Connolly had been saying things which were very controversial, and many thought that he was just trying to draw the British out to attack him and to attack the Union, which would have brought a great deal of public opinion over on his side. But he was saying things like that he thought that the volunteers were what he called wolf-be-wolf tones. So the fact of the matter is they didn't get along, but then in January of 1916, from that point forward, they were very much on the same page. And both the volunteers, the IRB, and the Citizen Army were of one mind, and that there was going to be a rising, and the rising was going to be scheduled for Easter.
Could you explain Ireland's relationship with Germany then?
Well, the relationship was rather complicated. I think if historians look back at the First World War, the First World War started in August, but the First World War was clearly in the cards for many, many years ahead of time. If you take a look at Erskine Childers writing The Riddle of the Sands, this was a precursor, and this was 10 years before it. So people knew there were things going on. Joseph Plunkett went over to the German National Imperial Command, and he talked to them about things long before this. Of course, you've got Roger Casement, who was over there, who was trying to raise a legion of Irish prisoners to fight for the Germans and that sort of thing. And then the German armed ship, the Oud, which was lost in Cork, would have been very important for the Rising had it been able to bring the arms ashore, get them distributed, actually get them into the hands of the rebels and have them know what they're doing. From the German point of view, I don't think that they had tremendous faith in the Rising coming off and affecting the war. They obviously at no time were going to send any kind of German officers over here. The concept that they were going to send submarines over or any kind of a German fleet, it was ludicrous. That was never in the German plans at all. It wasn't there. I think the Germans thought if this comes off, and in fact the Irish can take either A, some heat against us by tying up some British troops, it would have been very important, or B, they can actually win, and maybe they might let us have some of their ports or something like that. It's true. But I don't think the Germans gave nearly as much credit to the Irish Rebellion as sometimes those who condemn the Irish Rebellion give to the Germans, thinking that this was very much a part of the German plan for World War I.